At a quiet dinner table inside a mansion, a little girl looks up and says something no one expected. "I wish Mr. Graham was my daddy. I want a brother just like him." Her mother freezes. Her boss chokes on his drink, and his wife upstairs somehow feels it in her bones. That single innocent wish shatters the silence, exposing desires, regrets, and secrets that were never meant to surface. What starts as a child's pure longing becomes a dangerous proposition, a silent agreement, and a test of love, betrayal, and belonging. Stay with us to witness how a little voice can shake the foundation of a family and create one no one saw coming. Dinner was nearly over when it happened. Ellie, 6 years old and unbothered by the weight of adult restraint, kept swinging her legs under the table as she scooped up mashed potatoes with her fork. Her hair was slightly messy from school, her cheeks still red from the autumn wind outside, and her words came with the ease of someone who had nothing to lose. "Mommy," she said without looking up, "Mr. Graham could be my daddy. I wish I had a baby brother just like him." The fork in Rachel's hand froze halfway to her mouth. Graham Carter, seated across the table in his usual tailored navy sweater, had taken a sip of wine and now sputtered quietly, coughing just once, but enough to break the brittle stillness of the room. The remark didn't feel like the babble of a child. It landed like a confession none of them had rehearsed. Rachel glanced at her daughter, hoping to see mischief in her eyes. There was none, just sincerity. She tried to brush it off with a chuckle that came out flat. "Ellie," she said gently, "we don't say things like that." But it was too late. The words had already lodged themselves into the air. Graham cleared his throat and looked at Rachel, then at Ellie, then back at his plate. He wasn't sure what the proper reaction was. Laugh, deflect, change the subject. Nothing seemed right. Rachel, for her part, stared hard at her napkin, avoiding both adult gazes in the room. She was used to cleaning up messes, but this one wasn't made of spills or dust. She could feel something shift inside Graham, the way his fingers tapped the edge of his glass now, the slight tension in his jaw. He wasn't angry. If anything, he looked moved. And that scared her more than if he had been outraged. Ellie continued eating like nothing had happened, humming softly, unaware that she had cracked open a quiet vault sealed by years of civility and circumstance. Graham finally spoke, his voice casual but slightly off-key. "Kids say the funniest things," he said, with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Rachel forced herself to nod. "They really do." But her hands were trembling in her lap. Because she wasn't just Rachel, the housekeeper anymore, not in that moment. She was a woman who had just been cast into someone else's daydream. Madeline Carter wasn't even in the room, but her presence was there, etched into every decision, every unspoken rule that hovered over the dining table like invisible ink on a contract. She was upstairs, reviewing design samples for the renovation of the sunroom, likely sipping her chamomile tea in one of the sleek white mugs she insisted on importing from France. She hadn't heard Ellie's voice, but Rachel had no doubt she would feel the tremor. That was the kind of woman Madeline was, sharp in ways that didn't require ears. The comment would find its way to her eventually, as all cracks in the foundation did. Rachel glanced toward the ceiling as if expecting footsteps. There were none, just silence. A silence so dense it left no space for comfort. And in that silence, Rachel couldn't stop her mind from reaching back to the moments when Graham had knelt to tie Ellie's shoes without prompting, had brought her books from the bookstore downtown, had remembered the name of her stuffed rabbit and used it in casual conversation. It had always felt harmless, kind even, but now it felt dangerous. Now it felt like something she should have named and stopped before Ellie ever did. Graham set down his glass slowly, his hand steady even though his pulse was not. He turned to Ellie and gave her a smile, this time warmer, more human. "Why do you say that, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice softer than Rachel had ever heard it. Ellie shrugged, as children do. "Because you're nice," And you always listen, and you don't yell like the dads at Emily's school." She paused, then added innocently, "You even make Mum laugh sometimes." Rachel's mouth opened, then closed again. She had no defense, no way to make that sentiment sound insignificant, because Ellie wasn't wrong. Graham was kind to her in the quiet, consistent way that made loneliness easy to forget, and Rachel did laugh more these days, not because she was happy necessarily, but because someone in that house still saw her as more than an employee. Graham reached over to adjust Ellie's collar, a gesture so paternal it made Rachel want to cry. But she couldn't. Not here. Not now. Instead, she busied herself stacking plates, as if routine could absorb the impact of a 6-year-old's truth bomb. She stood and began collecting the dishes, her fingers shaking just slightly. "Ellie, it's bedtime soon. Why don't you go get your pajamas on?" Ellie nodded and hopped down, her little shoes tapping against the tile as she headed toward the hallway. When she was gone, the kitchen returned to that vacuum of tension it had mastered so well over the years. Graham stood too, stepping closer to Rachel, not enough to cross any lines, but enough for her to feel the weight of his presence. "I didn't mean to make this uncomfortable," he said quietly. Rachel didn't answer right away. She focused on the dish in her hand, rinsing it longer than necessary. "You didn't," she said at last. She did. There was no resentment in her voice, only a strange kind of sadness. "She sees things," Rachel continued, her tone barely audible over the water. "Things we don't want her to, things we pretend aren't there." Graham's silence agreed with her. There was nothing else to say. Not without unraveling the very fabric that kept them on opposite sides of that home. And yet, as Rachel turned off the faucet and dried her hands, she knew the thread had already been pulled. Not enough to tear, but enough to loosen. Graham returned to his seat as Rachel wiped the table mechanically, her eyes distant. Upstairs, the soft creak of floorboards signaled that Madeline was moving again, possibly heading for bed, possibly aware of nothing or everything. No one dared bring up Ellie's words again, but they didn't need to. Her voice had already lodged itself into the framework of the house. A child had spoken what the adults never would. She had said with a kind of fearless purity exactly what no one else could. And though the night would continue with dishes washed and lights turned off and doors closed quietly, something had shifted. Something irreversible. In a house where emotions were folded neatly like linen napkins, Ellie had thrown a stain no one could ignore. The sentence still hovered. "I wish I had a baby brother just like Mr. Graham." And in that instant, something within each of them cracked just enough to let the truth begin to seep in. Rachel hadn't meant to run into him. She had only come upstairs to grab a fresh blanket for Ellie, who had kicked hers off in her sleep again. But as she stepped into the dim hallway, Graham was already there, standing by the tall window at the end of the corridor, back turned, one hand loosely gripping the railing. He wasn't dressed for bed, nor did he look like he'd come from any particular task. He simply stood there, as if waiting for something he couldn't name. Rachel paused for a second, considering whether to turn back before he noticed, but he turned toward her before she could retreat. Their eyes met, and neither of them looked away. There were no greetings, no explanations, just a heavy, charged quiet. They both knew what it was about, though no one said the words. Ellie's dinner table remark had dug into something raw inside both of them. Rachel held the folded blanket in front of her chest like armor, and Graham took a step forward, not threatening, just deliberate. His face didn't hold a smile, but it wasn't cold either. It was unsettled, tired in the way only emotional exhaustion causes. A man stretched between restraint and something more human than his marriage allowed. "I couldn't sleep," he said quietly, breaking the silence like someone cracking glass underfoot. Rachel nodded slowly, still unsure of what to say. She didn't want to encourage this, whatever this was. "Me neither," she murmured, though it wasn't entirely true. She had been asleep until Ellie called out. But she couldn't say that. Saying anything real might draw out the weight of the moment, and she wasn't ready for its consequences. Graham leaned his shoulder against the wall. Do you ever feel like we're all ghosts in this house? Living parallel lives, never quite touching. His voice was soft, but there was something raw underneath. Rachel exhaled through her nose, shifting the blanket in her arms. I try not to feel too much in this house, she said. Makes it harder to do my job. He nodded, but his eyes didn't leave her. You do more than your job, he said. Ellie's not the only one who sees that. That made her flinch, not visibly, but internally. She wasn't supposed to matter. She was supposed to fade into the background. It was safer that way. And yet, here he was, making her visible. She looked away, unable to stand the weight of his attention. Don't, she said, almost too quickly. Don't say things like that. Graham didn't apologize. He just straightened, then walked a little closer, leaving barely 2 feet between them. I'm not trying to complicate anything, he said, and somehow that was worse. I haven't stopped thinking about what Ellie said. Rachel's arms tightened around the blanket. She's a child, she replied, trying to inject a firmness she didn't feel. She says what pops into her head. She doesn't understand what it means. Graham's voice dropped lower, but his tone didn't waver. Maybe she understands more than we do. Maybe it's not about the words. Maybe it's about what's missing. That line, what's missing, hung between them like a ghost. Rachel swallowed hard. Her heart was beating too fast. She was angry at him for making her feel seen and angry at herself for wanting to be seen. She had come into this house for stability, for income, not for temptation. And yet here he was, this man with a quiet sadness and unspoken ache that echoed too closely to her own. The truth was, she had noticed things. How he lingered in the kitchen when Ellie was around, how he asked about school, remembered her favorite book, knelt to help with a shoelace as if it came naturally. She told herself he was just being kind, a decent man in a world where most men weren't. But deep down, Rachel had known it was more complicated. She had seen the softness in him when he looked at Ellie, not the performative gestures, but something real, something wanting. And tonight, in this hallway, that undercurrent broke the surface. She looked at him now and saw not her employer, not the man who paid her check, but someone unraveling quietly, someone who carried the weight of a marriage that had dried up years ago but kept surviving through ritual and appearances. Rachel wasn't naive. She knew how easily loneliness could disguise itself as affection, but she also knew that this moment wasn't one-sided. And that terrified her more than anything. Then came the pause, not awkward, but loaded, like silence right before a door is either shut or kicked open. Graham stepped closer, enough for her to feel the warmth of his presence, but not enough to touch. What if? He started, then stopped. Rachel held her breath. His voice, when it returned, was so quiet, she almost thought she imagined it. What if you gave me that child? The words shattered her. Not because they were crude, they weren't. Not even because they were shocking. Some part of her had seen it coming. It was the sincerity that did it. The painful, devastating sincerity. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. Her entire body went still. The hallway suddenly felt too narrow, like the walls had leaned in closer. Graham, she finally said, voice thin. But he wasn't pressing. He stood there, watching her with the open vulnerability of someone who knew he was crossing a line, but didn't know how else to speak what was clawing inside him. He hadn't proposed a transaction. He had asked for something sacred, something ruinous. And in that silence, heavy with everything unsaid, the question remained, whispered, indecent, unexpectedly sincere. What if you gave me that child? Rachel wanted to run. Every part of her, instinct, pride, fear, was screaming at her to turn around, to pretend none of it had ever been spoken aloud. She kept telling herself she wasn't that woman, that she'd never be the kind to entertain something so wrong, so loaded. But Graham wouldn't let her disappear into silence. He wasn't pleading, not begging or pressuring. That would have made it easier to shut him down. Instead, he was steady, infuriatingly sincere, and that sincerity shattered her defenses far more than manipulation ever could. "I'm not asking for your body," he'd said that night, blocking the hallway like someone afraid to let go of a moment. "I'm asking for something I shouldn't want, but can't stop needing. I want a child that's real. Not one that shows up in a file with a number and a waiting list." Rachel had felt that punch in her chest, not because she agreed, but because she understood. Not because it was romantic, but because it was honest. She had seen it in his eyes, the quiet despair, the long stretch of a life performed instead of lived. And though she hated it, part of her saw her own reflection in that same emptiness. What haunted Rachel wasn't just the suggestion itself, but the way he looked at her after saying it, as if she were more than just a solution, as if she were the only person in that house who still had a soul left to offer. "You don't know what you're saying," she had muttered, trying to keep her voice from cracking. But Graham knew. He knew exactly what he was saying, and that's what made it so dangerous. "I do," he replied calmly. "I've been thinking it for months. I just didn't have the courage to say it until she did." She, Ellie. That name, that small voice at the dinner table, had set this wildfire in motion. Rachel wanted to scream at him about consequences, about betrayal, about how her life wasn't a bandage for his grief. But she didn't scream, because she couldn't deny that Ellie had said what neither of them could, that something broken inside this house had started to crave something whole. And no matter how wrong it was, that truth was louder than any protest Rachel could muster. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. And sometimes silence is the most dangerous answer of all. Meanwhile, Madeline Carter was flipping through adoption profiles like shopping pages in a glossy catalogue. There was no emotion in her eyes as she read through names, ages, available since dates. It was as if she were browsing fabric swatches for new curtains. She had a notepad where she wrote notes: good family health history, not too dark-skinned, quiet temperament, as if building a checklist. It should have felt hopeful. But everything about her movement spoke of calculation, not yearning. To her, motherhood was a role to be fulfilled, a title to be claimed, a void to be managed. Graham watched her from the doorway once, unnoticed. She hadn't asked him to sit down, hadn't looked up, hadn't said a word. She was chasing the appearance of completeness, but not the substance. And he knew it. It was in that numbness that his guilt festered, because part of him had already emotionally defected from the life they were pretending to live. And the more she planned a future with a child she hadn't met, the more Graham found himself imagining one that already had a face, a name, a mother. The note was never meant to be read. It was a half-written thought Graham had shoved into the breast pocket of a dress shirt he barely wore. Scribbled and crossed out repeatedly, it was barely legible. "She carries a light this house forgot. Maybe our child isn't far." It wasn't addressed to anyone, not really. Maybe to himself, maybe to Madeline, maybe to the version of him that still believed in things like redemption. He didn't even remember leaving it there until he heard her voice from the study 2 days later. Quiet, slow, sharpened. "Is this yours?" She was holding the note in her hand like it was evidence in a trial. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Her eyes stayed locked on the paper, even as her other hand trembled slightly, but she didn't yell. She didn't slap him or throw anything or cry. Madeline Carter didn't do mess. She did control. She folded the paper neatly, placed it on the table, and said, "If that child is born, he will be mine, will..." It was a declaration, not a plea, not a question, a verdict. The way she said it made something in Graham sink. It wasn't maternal, it wasn't emotional. It was possession dressed in silk. She didn't see a baby, she saw leverage. A way to secure her role, to fix the cracks she refused to admit existed. Rachel had once asked herself whether Madeline wanted to be a mother, or simply feared being a woman who couldn't. The answer stood in front of him now. She had found her way to claim something she couldn't create, not through love, but through domination. "No one ever has to know," she added, smoothing a crease in her dress like she'd just closed a deal. "It will be clean, controlled. You'll still have your legacy, and I'll have my child." Graham said nothing, because even though everything in him recoiled, part of him had created this. This mess, this cruelty, this possibility, his silence had birthed a war. The woman who had never learned to love now saw a chance to possess what she could never create. Rachel felt the world slow down from the moment she saw the positive result. It was a cheap drugstore test, bought with trembling hands during her lunch break, hidden under a pack of wet wipes and paper towels. The two lines appeared so quickly, so definitively, that there was no space left for doubt, only a sudden silence inside her that felt like both the collapse and the birth of something enormous. She sat on the closed lid of the toilet in the Carters' guest bathroom, unable to cry or smile or breathe properly. She wanted to believe that she was still in control, that she could still choose where this path led. But the truth pressed against her chest, like a second heartbeat. She had said no to Graham, or at least she'd thought she had, but somewhere between silence and survival, between shared glances and unspeakable needs, a door had opened, and now there was life inside her. Not just a possibility, not just an idea, a child, her child. And already it didn't feel like hers alone. At home, Ellie had picked up on the shift without being told a thing. Children had a way of sensing the tremors adults tried to mask. She didn't ask questions. She simply began drawing babies in all her sketches, tiny, rounded faces with sleepy eyes and floating curls. "He's gonna be funny," she said one night as Rachel tucked her in. "How do you know it's a boy?" Rachel asked, trying not to sound shaken. Ellie shrugged, her voice matter-of-fact. "I can feel him giggling. Inside you. Sometimes I can almost hear it." Rachel laughed softly then, but only because crying would have cracked something open she wasn't ready to face. She had hoped that hiding the truth from Ellie would protect her. But how do you hide what radiates from your skin, from your pulse, from the way your hand never leaves your stomach, even when you sleep? Graham became more present after that. Not in grand gestures, he wasn't the type, but in consistent, quiet ones that made everything harder to ignore. He remembered what teas helped her nausea. He started eating dinner at the kitchen table instead of in his study. He brought Ellie new crayons, just because, and yet Rachel found herself recoiling from the warmth of it all. Because every time he did something kind, something soft, it chipped away at her resolve. She didn't want to fall for him, not here, not under these conditions, not while carrying the weight of an arrangement no one could speak of out loud. But the way he looked at her now was different. Not lustful, not proprietary, just hopeful. And that hope terrified her more than anything. Was he falling in love, or was he just falling deeper into the idea of fatherhood, desperate to anchor himself to something pure after years of marital coldness? And worse, was Rachel allowing herself to believe she was more than a vessel in this story? She hated herself for wondering, for hoping, for replaying every little thing he did and weighing it for secret meanings. The way his eyes softened when Ellie called him Mr. Graham, with affection. The way his hand lingered for half a second longer when he handed her a coffee cup. The way he asked, gently, if she was sleeping enough. And somewhere between her guilt and her cravings and her fragile nights lying awake, Rachel realized she was starting to imagine things she had no right to. A home, a child laughing, a man who stayed. And the possibility of all that, fragile and foolish as it was, made her more vulnerable than she'd been in her entire life. Still, she said nothing, because naming it would make it real. And she didn't know yet if she could survive real. But not everyone stayed silent. Madeline had always known how to read the undercurrents in her house, even if she pretended not to. And now, she was watching. The late-night lights under Rachel's door. The careful way Graham avoided eye contact during breakfast. The soft, protective touch Rachel placed on her belly when she thought no one was looking. Madeline saw it all, and what she saw wasn't the miracle of new life, it was betrayal, not of the flesh, but of something more sacred to her, control. She didn't confront them, she didn't need to. Her silence was a scalpel. She sharpened it with every glance, every clipped word, every icy nod. And while Graham leaned into hope, and Rachel trembled between fear and longing, Madeline began to prepare, not with emotion, but with precision. Because to her, this wasn't a child growing inside another woman's body. This was a threat growing inside her house. Ellie, with the magical wisdom of children, didn't understand power or betrayal or manipulation. She only understood connection, warmth, joy. One night, as Rachel sat on the couch folding laundry, Ellie crawled beside her and pressed her ear against her mother's belly. "I can already hear him laughing inside you, Mommy," she whispered, a sleepy smile on her face. Rachel froze, her hand moved protectively over her daughter's hair, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe that this was all it had to be, a mother, a daughter, and a child on the way. But in the shadows of the hallway, just out of sight, stood someone else who heard it too, Madeline. And what she heard wasn't laughter. It was a declaration of war. Madeline moved with chilling precision. The decision had already been made in her mind. If this child was going to enter the Carter home, he would enter it on her terms. She called the interior designer herself, requesting that the guest room next to the master suite be converted into a nursery. White, everything white, clean lines, no clutter, she instructed without pause, flipping through a catalogue as if choosing a set for a magazine spread, not preparing to receive a living soul. The walls were repainted before the end of the week. A Scandinavian crib arrived in a wooden crate the size of a coffin, a changing table, a rocking chair, plush rugs that would never feel a child's toes. Madeline curated it all like a showroom. She didn't ask Rachel for input. She didn't even look at her directly. But Rachel was made to witness every detail, every staged moment, as if her body, the one carrying the baby, was merely incidental. The photographers came on a Tuesday morning, instructed to capture the anticipation. They photographed the crib, the light through the window. Madeline standing at the door, one hand on her belly that would never swell. Rachel watched from the hallway, silent. Each day, the walls closed in tighter around Rachel. She felt herself becoming invisible again, like she'd once been in the early days of cleaning floors and folding linen in silence. Only now she wasn't invisible to the house. She was invisible to the story Madeline was constructing. A story in which she, Rachel, didn't exist. There were no questions about her doctor's appointments, no conversations about how she was feeling. Madeline referred to the baby as him, but never as yours. It was always the baby, or my son, Graham noticed. At first, he stood on the periphery, unsure of how to intervene, but as the weeks passed, hesitation curdled into shame. He tried in small ways to pull Rachel back into the reality of it, buying her snacks she craved, asking how the baby was moving, placing a gentle hand on her back when they passed in the kitchen. But his gestures weren't loud enough to drown out what Madeline was doing. He was split down the middle, between the woman he had made a silent pact with and the one who wore his last name and commanded his house. Rachel didn't expect him to choose, but every time he turned away, she died a little more inside. Ellie, on the other hand, never stopped believing that everything was good and simple and whole. Her drawings had evolved from abstract babies to family portraits. She began asking questions that pierced Rachel like knives. "He's gonna sleep in my room sometimes, right? And when he cries, can I hold him too? Does he like peanut butter already?" Rachel would nod, stroke her daughter's hair, smile as if nothing was wrong. Because how do you explain to a child that the baby growing inside her mother might not live with them? How do you prepare a little girl to love someone who may be taken away, whose name might not be spoken again? Rachel swallowed her screams, pressing them down into her spine until smiling became a form of survival. Every time she heard Ellie's voice filled with hope, she forced herself to respond gently, to not let the bitterness leak through. Because Ellie deserved joy, she deserved to believe, even if Rachel was slowly unraveling behind every answer. The worst part wasn't the room or the silence or even the lies. It was the inevitability of it all, the feeling that everything had been decided long before Rachel ever missed her first period. Madeline had claimed the baby without ever touching Rachel's belly. She did it with contractors, invoices, emails to designers, and calendar appointments for prenatal photo shoots Rachel wasn't invited to. She wielded control the way others wielded weapons. And Rachel, she was just trying to breathe. She told herself she was strong, that she was doing this for Ellie, that somehow it would be okay in the end. But with every new blanket folded, every pair of baby shoes placed on white shelves she couldn't touch, Rachel felt her own child slipping further away from her. Then came the question. It was a Sunday morning, and Rachel was cutting strawberries for Ellie's breakfast. The girl was humming to herself, swinging her legs at the kitchen island. Without looking up, she asked, "But he's going to live with me, right?" The knife paused mid-slice. Rachel stared at the bright red fruit bleeding onto the cutting board. Ellie finally looked up, sensing the tension. "Mommy?" Her voice was soft, but persistent. Rachel forced a smile, blinking back the sting in her eyes. "Of course he is, baby," she lied, because she didn't know how to tell the truth. "Of course." Ellie smiled, satisfied, and returned to her cereal. Rachel turned away before the tears could fall, her hand pressing instinctively to the place the baby had just kicked. The baby kicked again, hard, insistent, as if trying to answer. Rachel clutched her stomach, stunned by the sudden jolt. Ellie looked over and laughed. "He heard me," she said, giggling. Rachel managed a shaky laugh too, nodding. "Yeah," she whispered, more to herself than anyone. "He heard you." The name came quietly, almost as if it had been waiting for the right moment to be spoken. Ellie was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, flipping through a picture book of angels someone had donated to the local library. She pointed to a golden-haired figure on the page and said with perfect, unshakable certainty, "Michael, I think that should be his name." Graham, who had just walked in from a long day at work, froze in the doorway. He stared at his daughter, Rachel's daughter, but also his in every way that now mattered, and something unnameable stirred in his chest. "Michael," he repeated softly, as if testing the taste of it on his tongue. It felt right. Rachel, who had been folding baby clothes in the corner of the room, didn't say a word at first, but later that night, in the dim light of her bedroom, she opened her bedside drawer, pulled out a small, spiral notebook, and wrote the name carefully on the top line of a blank page. Michael. She stared at it for several seconds. Then she closed the notebook and buried it beneath a stack of old receipts and children's drawings. It wasn't just a name. It was hers. For a few days, they shared it only among themselves. Rachel began to whisper it when she rubbed her belly at night. Graham used it in conversations that weren't meant to be heard. Small things like, "Michael kicked again today," spoken over a glass of wine, while Rachel cleaned up Ellie's toys. Ellie would draw pictures with the names scribbled in awkward handwriting beneath a stick figure swaddled in blue. These quiet, unsanctioned moments were more than rebellion. They were sacred. A name is a kind of ownership, and for Rachel, it was the only thing grounding her in the midst of a reality that no longer felt like hers. But the secret didn't stay safe for long. One morning, Madeline overheard Ellie say the name while playing with her dolls. The reaction was immediate and colder than anything Rachel had braced herself for. That night after dinner, Madeline cornered Graham in his study, her voice sharp, final. "No names. He will be whatever I say he is." She didn't ask where the name had come from. She didn't need to. The air around Rachel became tenser, tighter, like invisible wires closing in. From that moment forward, the battle lines were drawn, and they were no longer metaphorical. The baby had become territory, and the name was the first hill to be defended. Rachel could feel it in every glance Madeline threw her way, every moment she ignored her presence, in conversations about the baby and his future. She would talk to decorators about monogrammed blankets with a blank placeholder for initials. She had a list of names approved by a family therapist. "No more surprises," she said with her signature dismissiveness. Rachel said nothing in return, but later that night she wrote Michael again. This time, in the back cover of a children's storybook she planned to read to the baby one day. She tucked it into her closet behind the boxes marked seasonal. Every repetition of the name became an act of defiance. She didn't yell, didn't plead. She knew Graham was conflicted, caught in a web spun by years of obligation and carefully managed image. But when he looked at her belly and then looked away, she knew he'd said the name in his heart too. That was enough. For now. Ellie never stopped calling him Michael. "Good night, Michael," she'd whisper to Rachel's belly, kissing it before bed. "Don't let the bad dreams in." Rachel couldn't bring herself to correct her, even when Madeline raised an eyebrow across the dinner table. To Ellie, it wasn't rebellion. It was relationship. It was her way of building a bridge before the baby even arrived. And Rachel clung to that bridge with all her strength. When she shopped alone for diapers and clothes, with what little money she'd saved, she would buy one thing, just one, for Michael. A pair of socks, a pacifier, a onesie. She kept them all in a drawer at the back of her room, the real room, the room where the baby kicked while she cried into a pillow at night. The room where names had meaning, where promises lived. It made no sense to fight for something so small in the face of something so enormous, but Rachel understood that this name, this one word, was the thread connecting her to the child she still feared losing. Michael wasn't just a name, it was the only truth she had left. The tension reached a boiling point one evening when Madeline found the name embroidered on a bib inside the laundry basket. It had been stitched carefully, beautifully, by one of Rachel's elderly neighbors who didn't know the whole story. "Just a gift," the woman had said, smiling. But to Madeline, it was proof of betrayal. She didn't raise her voice. She rarely did, but she placed the bib on the kitchen counter as if it were evidence in a trial. "This stops now," she said simply. "No more fantasies. No more naming things that don't belong to you." Rachel didn't answer. She stared at the little bib with Michael stitched in soft blue thread and felt a chill deeper than anger. She took the bib, folded it quietly, and returned it to her drawer. Then she sat on her bed and whispered the name 5 times, slow and steady, like a prayer. "Michael, Michael, 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 Michael." No one could take that from her, not even Madeline. From that moment on, everything became a battle. The name became a symbol of resistance, and each time Rachel whispered Michael to herself, she was reaffirming that this child was more hers than any contracts. Rachel had learned to ignore the sharp pulling sensations, the small dizzy spells, the swelling in her ankles, and the headaches that whispered warnings from the moment she woke to the moment she collapsed into restless sleep. She told herself they were normal, just pregnancy discomforts. Nothing alarming, But that day, while she was folding a basket of Ellie's laundry, shirts with grass stains, socks missing their pair, everything went sideways. Her vision dimmed, her knees buckled, and before she could call out, the world disappeared in a blur of white static. The laundry room door was slightly ajar, just enough for Ellie to hear the thud. She came running, barefoot, her cereal bowl abandoned mid-bite on the kitchen counter. "Mommy!" she called once, twice. When Rachel didn't answer, Ellie screamed, loud, panicked. Not the cry of a little girl, but of someone watching their world fall apart. Graham had been upstairs, trying to read a contract he couldn't focus on. The sound of Ellie's voice cut through everything. He ran, past the stairs, down the hall, into the room where Rachel lay slumped, her body curled in on itself like it was protecting the life inside. He didn't hesitate. He scooped her up and held her like she was weightless. Carrying Rachel through the darkened house, Graham felt something shift, not in the weight of her body, but in his own center. She wasn't just the woman who worked for them. She wasn't just the mother of a child born out of whispered desperation and conflicted choices. She was his. In ways he hadn't admitted out loud, not even to himself. Ellie trailed behind him, tears streaking her cheeks, whispering over and over, "Is she gonna be okay? Please, is she gonna be okay?" Graham didn't answer. He couldn't lie, not now. When he reached the front door, he didn't call for Madeline. He didn't ask permission. He simply opened the door, placed Rachel carefully in the back seat of the car, and drove. His jaw clenched, his mind racing. Behind him, standing on the grand staircase, Madeline watched it all unfold. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable. She didn't move, didn't ask what happened. She simply observed, cold, distant, calculating. It was not concern that flickered across her face, but something closer to strategy. Rachel, unconscious, never saw her, but Graham did, and something inside him hardened. At the hospital, under white fluorescent lights and the sterile air of maternity chaos, Rachel came to. Her first words were for Ellie. "Where's my baby?" she asked, her hand flying to her belly. "He's fine," Graham said gently, brushing hair from her forehead. "You both are." The nurse confirmed it minutes later, the baby's heartbeat strong, Rachel's vitals stabilizing, but there was concern in the doctor's voice, exhaustion, malnutrition, emotional distress, words that landed like quiet accusations. Rachel tried to apologize. Graham silenced her. "You don't say sorry for breaking in a world that never gave you space to breathe." She cried then, not out of fear, but from the strange safety of being seen. When the doctor left and the room quieted, Rachel turned to him and asked simply, "Will you stay?" There was no hesitation. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. And he didn't. He sat beside her the entire night, holding her hand when she fell asleep, whispering stories to the baby in her belly, promising things he wasn't sure he had the right to promise, but knowing he would rather break rules than break her again. Michael came just before dawn. A surge of pain, a rush of nurses, a blur of movement, and then a cry. Loud, healthy, furious. Rachel sobbed the moment she heard it. Graham was at her side the entire time, not Madeline. It was he who cut the cord, his hands trembling as he made the snip that turned a fetus into a son. When they placed the baby on Rachel's chest, her arms wrapped around him with a fierceness that surprised even herself. Graham leaned close, kissed her forehead, then the baby's. "Welcome home, Michael," he whispered. The name once forbidden was now gospel. Nurses smiled. The room seemed to exhale. For a moment, everything made sense. Who they were, how far they'd come, and what it cost. Rachel looked into Graham's eyes and saw no hesitation. He was no longer standing on a line between two women. He was here, fully, finally. No contracts, no masks, just a man, a woman, and the child they'd made in silence, but now celebrated in daylight. Madeline arrived later, Her heels clicked against the hospital floor like punctuation marks to a statement no one had asked for. She wore a navy trench coat, makeup perfectly done, hair in a low chignon. She entered the room smiling, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I came as soon as I could," she said, placing a bouquet of sterile white flowers on the side table. She didn't kiss Rachel. She didn't touch the baby. Instead, she opened her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. "Time to make official what was promised," she said, her voice even, rehearsed. Inside was a draft birth certificate, spaces filled in neatly, except for the baby's name. Madeline paused, waiting for someone to object. No one did. Rachel held Michael tighter. Graham said nothing. But when Madeline looked up at her husband, expecting his signature, she caught something in his eyes. Not defiance, not anger, but distance. Something had broken loose. Something had shifted in Graham's eyes. Was beside him on the chair, her head leaning on his arm, her fingers brushing the baby's cheek with wonder. Her eyes sparkled like someone who had finally found the last missing piece in a long-lost puzzle. Rachel watched them from across the room, a lump forming in her throat. It looked too perfect, like a photograph you'd see in a magazine spread about family values, except the truth behind it was anything but clean. Madeline stood near the doorway, adjusting the light in the room, giving short instructions to the hospital photographer she'd hired without consulting anyone. "Hold the baby up a little more, Graham," she said, already reviewing the last shot on her phone. "Ellie, sweetie, smile a little bigger." Rachel turned her head away. The sterile pressure of it all, the posing, the pretending, the performative joy, made her chest tighten. She felt like she was suffocating. She hadn't even signed the birth certificate, and already decisions were being made around her. Photos, announcements. A name no one asked her to confirm, a role she was being asked to erase. The photographer's camera clicked again, and something inside Rachel snapped, not with rage, but with a soft and terrifying clarity. She needed air, not the kind hospitals pump through vents, but real air. She stepped back, then walked toward the hallway, her hands shaking. Madeline noticed. "Where are you going?" she asked, not with concern, but suspicion. "I need to breathe," Rachel said, not stopping. She didn't wait for permission. In the hallway, she leaned against the cold wall and closed her eyes. For the first time since Michael's birth, she let herself feel everything at once: joy, fear, resentment, exhaustion, love. She could still hear Ellie's soft giggle from inside the room. That sound, innocent and pure, grounded her more than anything else could. But even that couldn't silence the voice in her head. What if I ran? Not just from Madeline, from all of it. What if she took Ellie and the baby and disappeared? Somewhere no one could reduce her to a service or a signature. But even as the fantasy formed, she knew it came with a cost she wasn't sure she could pay. When she turned back into the room, Graham met her halfway. He wasn't holding the baby anymore. Ellie had him now, cradled like a doll, whispering lullabies she made up on the spot. Graham's expression wasn't one of control or possession. It was devastation. He looked like a man stripped of every defense. Rachel stopped walking when she saw him like that. He didn't speak at first, just held her gaze. Finally, with a voice raw and cracked, he said, "Forgive me. I didn't know love could hurt like this." He didn't try to explain or justify. He didn't mention Madeline or their agreement or the walls closing in around them. He simply said what mattered. Rachel felt her knees weaken, not from anger, but from the weight of being seen, of being chosen, not as a surrogate, not as a mistake, but as someone who mattered. She hadn't heard that kind of sincerity in months, maybe years. Without waiting for a response, Graham walked to the end of the hall and opened the door to what had once been the white room. Rachel hesitated. She remembered how hollow it had felt the first time she saw it. Blank walls, catalogue furniture, a life curated for display, not living. But when she stepped inside now, she froze. The room had changed. Ellie's drawings were taped across one wall, crayon suns and stick figures holding hands, stars, a baby in between two smiling parents. Rachel recognized her own face in the drawing, not just a woman, not just mom. She was in it. A part of the story. On the shelf were toys Ellie had picked out, a tiny onesie with little brother stitched in green thread. None of it looked expensive, but all of it was real. And it hadn't been Madeline, it had been Graham and Ellie. And maybe, just maybe, a part of Rachel too. It wasn't the room she feared anymore. It was the decision waiting in her chest. Graham didn't say anything else. He stood back and let her take it in. Rachel stepped toward the crib. She touched the rail softly. Her hand lingered. She could smell baby powder, faint and warm, and Ellie's favorite blanket folded neatly at the edge. Every instinct in her body told her to be cautious, but one deeper voice, a maternal-rooted one, whispered, "You belong here, if you choose to." For the first time, it wasn't anyone else deciding for her. Not Madeline, not Graham, not the courts, or the whispers, or the shame. She could say yes or no, but it would be hers. That realization hit her harder than any confrontation ever could. She was no longer being dragged through someone else's storm. She was standing on her own ground, holding her own truth. Michael's future could begin or end right here, and all it would take was one decision. For the first time, Rachel felt that the baby had a place there, but only if she said yes, and for the first time, she was the one deciding. The letter wasn't really a letter, at least not in the conventional sense. It was a piece of folded construction paper with hearts and suns and one very crooked house drawn in thick crayon lines. Inside, scribbled in shaky handwriting, were uneven words that took effort to decipher, but none to feel. Ellie had worked on it all morning, tongue between her teeth, asking Rachel how to spell words like brother and tummy, and then ignoring the corrections. She added her drawing last, a smiling stick-figure baby with a name above it, Michael, written in bright blue. Then, beneath it all, came the part that stopped time when it was read. "This is my brother Michael. He lives with us, but he came from my mommy's belly. Now we're all part of the same house, right?" Ellie signed her name in the bottom corner with a backwards E. She folded it up, kissed the paper, and handed it to Madeline without a second thought. "It's for you," she said, as if she were giving a flower, not a declaration. Madeline took it like she didn't know how to hold it, as though it were ticking, fragile, and too honest to ignore. She didn't read it right away. At first, Madeline stared at the child in front of her, blinking too fast. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, her voice thinner than usual. Ellie, pleased, skipped off to chase a butterfly in the garden. Alone now, Madeline sat on the edge of the lounge chair on the back patio and opened the folded paper. Her fingers smoothed the creases slowly, like she was bracing herself. The childish drawing hit her harder than any confrontation Graham had ever dared. The little house had 4 figures, not 3. A tall one labeled Daddy, a woman with red hair and a smile labeled Mommy, a small girl with 2 yellow pigtails marked Me, and a baby in a blue onesie named Michael. Rachel's face had freckles. Graham's stick figure had a tie. And there, next to Rachel, was a smaller stick woman without a name, off to the side, as if waiting for permission to be part of the scene. Madeline knew it was her. But what broke her wasn't her position. It was that even in a child's world, she wasn't the one who brought life into this family. She had been orbiting around it, always observing, never central. For a long time, she just sat there, the drawing open in her lap, her eyes tracing over every line. She didn't cry immediately. The first tears came like betrayal, stinging, unwanted. But they didn't come from anger. They came from the slow, agonizing realization that no amount of control, money, or precision could earn her the place she thought was hers by right. She had tried to engineer a life, from IVF appointments to adoption applications to nursery paint samples. But Ellie's drawing made it clear life had already bloomed, and not through her, not because of her. The child she claimed as hers had grown in another woman's body, loved her first, heard her heartbeat from the inside, and still, somehow, Madeline had been offered a seat at that table. A stick figure with no name but not erased, included, if only she could learn to sit still and stop trying to design everything. For a woman who had always defined herself by what she could organize and own, this truth was unbearable and liberating. That night she packed a small suitcase. She didn't say much, only that she needed some time away and that no one should wait for her. Graham didn't protest. He only asked, "Will you come back?" She paused for a second too long before answering. "I don't know yet," she whispered. But she kissed Ellie on the forehead while she slept and left the drawing folded neatly on the kitchen counter. Rachel found it the next morning and tucked it away in a drawer without a word. Days passed, then weeks. The nursery remained untouched, quiet. Ellie stopped asking where Madeline had gone, and Rachel didn't press either. But Graham, he watched the mailbox every morning as if expecting an answer that would never arrive in an envelope. Weeks later, a car pulled into the driveway. It wasn't planned. There was no warning call, no dramatic return, just the soft hum of a rental sedan and a door that opened slowly. Madeline stepped out in jeans and a simple cardigan, her face bare, her eyes swollen from travel or tears. No one could say. She didn't knock on the front door. She walked through the gate into the backyard where laughter was echoing softly. Rachel sat on the grass beneath the oak tree, Michael nestled in her arms, Ellie dancing barefoot in the sunlight, her hair wild and free. They didn't notice her at first, but when Rachel looked up, their eyes met. Nothing was said. Rachel didn't stand, didn't flinch. Madeline walked slowly across the grass and sat beside them, knees bent, palms flat on the earth. She didn't ask to hold the baby. She didn't comment on how much he had grown. She didn't speak at all, and Rachel, to her surprise, didn't break the silence either. Ellie giggled and flopped into her lap with the unfiltered trust only a child could offer. Madeline smiled, a small one, shaky, real. She wasn't claiming, she wasn't directing, she wasn't even apologizing. She was just there, present for once, without the armor. And that was enough. For the first time the mask cracked, not in shame or in anger, but in surrender. Madeline let herself sit among them, equal parts outsider and welcomed ghost. No words were needed. Not anymore. The paper drawing had already done the talking, and without saying a single word, Madeline sat beside them in the grass. Months had passed. Enough time for routines to settle, for wounds to scab over, for laughter to return in small but steady doses. The Carter house no longer held the same stiff silence that used to live in its halls. It breathed now, in coos and cries and bedtime stories, half finished before sleep took over. It pulsed with movement. Graham coming home with baby bottles instead of briefcases, Rachel humming lullabies while cooking, and Ellie telling anyone who would listen that her baby brother could already recognize her voice. But nothing marked the transformation quite like the envelope that arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. The doorbell rang once, short and unceremonious. Rachel opened the door to find the mailman already walking away, leaving behind a single plain envelope. No wax seals, no ornate handwriting. Just government print and weighty silence inside. She called for Graham. Together they opened it slowly, almost reverently. The name inside made them both stop breathing for just a second. Michael Miller Carter. Miller, Rachel's last name, Carter, Graham's. No asterisks, no footnotes, no legal qualifiers. One name, one boy, one family. Graham stared at the paper for a long time, running his thumb over the printed words as if trying to memorize them by touch. Rachel didn't speak. She didn't have to. There was something almost sacred about that moment. something quiet and irreversible. Graham finally stood, walked to the foyer, and took out the wooden nameplate he'd ordered weeks earlier, but hadn't had the courage to hang. With deliberate motions, he screwed it into place just beneath the doorbell. The letters were simple, hand-carved and stained a deep walnut, the Miller-Carter family. When he stepped back to admire it, Rachel joined him. Ellie, drawn by the clinking noise, came bounding toward them in a burst of energy. She squinted at the sign for a moment, her lips moving slowly as she read each word. Then she looked up at them both, her face full of that innocent clarity only children possess, and said with quiet pride, "Now, everybody has a name here." Graham bent down and kissed her forehead. Rachel bent lower, scooping Michael into her arms from the bassinet by the door. They all stood there for a while, the four of them, under that small piece of wood that meant more than any chandelier or marble floor ever could. Rachel didn't cry, but her throat ached with the weight of emotion she wouldn't let fall. This wasn't the life she had imagined years ago, when she'd first arrived at the Carter estate, just trying to keep her daughter fed and her dignity intact. This life, complicated, cracked, and glued back together, was something else entirely. It was better because it had been chosen, not given. She looked at Graham, holding Ellie close, and wondered how someone who once seemed untouchable could now look like home. Their journey hadn't been clean or gentle, it had bruised them, but they were still standing, and now Michael had a name that spoke of where he came from, all of it, and who had loved him into being. Ellie reached out to touch the sign again, tracing the M in Miller, then the C in Carter, like carving those letters into her own memory. "Michael Miller Carter," she whispered, as if naming a star. Behind them, on the porch, Madeline watched. She didn't step forward. She didn't announce herself. She simply leaned against the column with her coffee cradled in both hands, letting the moment happen without interference. The steam curled around her face, but it did nothing to hide the single tear trailing down her cheek. She hadn't won, she hadn't lost, but something inside her had softened, surrendered. For once, she wasn't trying to rewrite the story or claim ownership of the ending. She was just present, bearing witness. And that perhaps was her quiet form of belonging, to see love blooming from ground she once tried to pave over with control. Her gaze shifted to Michael, sleeping peacefully in Rachel's arms, his tiny fingers curled around the edge of a blanket Ellie had insisted on knitting. She smiled through the salt on her cheeks. This wasn't her child, but he was part of her history now, a thread she hadn't expected but couldn't deny. No one spoke. No one needed to. The baby stirred slightly in Rachel's arms, then settled again. His breath was steady, his dreams undisturbed. Graham placed a hand on Rachel's back and another on Ellie's shoulder. Rachel leaned into him, and for a second they were still, like the world had exhaled with them. Behind them, Madeline stepped off the porch and into the garden without a word, placing her coffee cup on the railing and sitting on the edge of the lawn, just as she had weeks ago. Not trying to be mother or matriarch, just someone who had once been lost and now, maybe, a little bit found. Ellie turned to look at her and smiled. "Are you going to help me paint Michael's name on the mailbox too?" she asked, skipping toward her. Madeline nodded, wiping her face quickly before Ellie saw too much. "Of course," she said. "Let's do it together." Michael slept through it all. He didn't know of the grief that made him, or the desire, or the choices. He didn't know about betrayals whispered in the dark, or forgiveness offered without words. He was only days old, wrapped in warmth, the weight of a new name cradling his future. But one day he would learn. He would see the sign on the door and understand that family isn't just who's there in the beginning. It's who stays when everything breaks. He would hear stories from Ellie, pieced together with crayon-colored truths. He would feel Madeline's quiet presence and Rachel's fierce love and Graham's humbled strength. And somehow, without understanding it fully, he would know he had been the child of the impossible, the brother born of a wish, and the beginning of a story that dared to end differently. We poured a lot of care and emotion into bringing this story to life, thinking of each one of you who follows our journey here. If this story touched your heart even a little, consider subscribing to our channel. It truly helps us keep creating more stories like this, stories that take days to write and produce with the love they deserve. Tell us in the comments what part of this story spoke to you the most. Your thoughts matter to us. We read every word. Explore our other videos too. We've built a whole library of stories made to inspire and move you. Thank you for being with us. See you in the next one.